Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Education webinar series. This is the final webinar in the spring term, and we will resume our webinar series in the fall semester starting from September. Our today's speaker is a faculty member at the Graduate School of Education, Dr. Michelle Bedeker, and today she will talk about the cracking the code, sense-making of academic discourse, practice, and literacies. So this webinar is being recorded for your information. Dear Michelle, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Adana. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. Welcome to this presentation. Just to give you some background, I will basically be sharing the way we've looked at these concepts within the South African context and how we're thinking of academic discourses and communities of practice and literacies in a way to provide some meaningful access for our students. So some of my examples and what we were doing would basically come from that context. But because I've anticipated that I would have more students, I have included a bit of strategies and how we can use our literacies and discourses and try and find these things within journal articles towards the end. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Can everyone see my screen? Everyone
yes.
Can see. Okay, so as you know, the title of my presentation is Cracking the Code, and it's basically sense-making of academic discourse, practices, and literacies. So the overview and purpose of this webinar is I'm going to highlight perceptions of the language problem in the South African context, but I also think it is kind of applicable in many other contexts. And why we started looking at students entering university from the perspective of epistemic access and discourses. Then I'll be focusing a bit on primary discourses and secondary discourses, focusing on G and these notions of ways of being and ways of knowing when we enter academia. And then I think for us in our work in South Africa, we have discovered that it's the secondary discourses that it's creating a challenge for our students because they end up with having, struggling with a sense of self, but also kind of confronting multiple selves, which they don't know what to do with. And then just take a quick look at situated learning and academic practice and what we try to do there. And then finally, I'll end off with reading to understand academic practice and discursive ways of being. So for us in South Africa, there was this whole conversation starting early from the 80s already when access was given to students of color. And all of a sudden, there was this discourse around students being unprepared or underprepared, and students not having the correct language because English was not their first language. And so what we found is that in academic development departments, it is common for faculty and staff to be asked to sort out or fix up or improve the language of the students as if it's only the language that's creating a problem in academia. So in our context, what the situation resulted in was basically that fixing means just fixing disconnected linguistic articles such as English grammar and vocabulary, and then getting them to understand academic skills such as referencing, paraphrasing, and writing essays. And all of these issues then became part of the language problem in South Africa. And in a way, what we were saying also was that if we give them all of these skills, we're producing scholars that are becoming consumers of knowledge rather than producers of their own knowledge. So if we teach them referencing, why is this important if you want to give them epistemic access? What is paraphrasing? And not paraphrasing for the sake of paraphrasing or referencing for the sake of referencing, but it's part of a particular discipline, and so it has particular discourses and practices associated with it. And so we try to think of the language problem in a different way. And I had a colleague who basically, at some point, she told me, you know, it's so easy for me to spot an excellent assignment. So I just know this is a good assignment. And then it's so much harder to mark an assignment that's 50%. And yet I can see that both of these kinds of students, they've acquired the content. The one just doesn't make sense. So what I do is I comment on grammar and flow and some academic conventions. But my feedback, I know it has something to do with my discipline, but I just cannot give the correct feedback to help the student going forward. And then we had the student saying, well, I understood the assignment requirements, but I didn't know how to write about it. For example, I added some citations, but I did not know how to add my point. I knew what I wanted to say, but I just couldn't express it in my writing. And so this is kind of the context where that I was working in South Africa, is where we kind of understood that not having the language doesn't mean not having the knowledge. And so it required us to think a bit deeper of what it is that the students would need. Is it English? Is it English only? Or is it more than English? And if it's more than English, what is it that they would need? So we started to ask, is it just a language problem? Is it a knowledge problem? Or is it a problem of academic norms and discourses? Or is it a combination of this? And that the student is basically caught between all of these identities and ways of being, that they're kind of struggling to actually find their own voice. So we've realized that the language problem experienced by our students, it's not just grammar and syntax. It kind of goes into the complexities and the values of the disciplines itself. So and why we started to realize this or think about it is that language varies amongst subjects. If we want the students to talk like mathematicians or to talk like scientists or like historians, we needed to start making explicit the discourses associated with these disciplines. So when they speak, they write, you hear somebody in the math discourse, somebody in the history department, and especially in the BA program for humanities, we found that our students are not confronting one language, but they're confronting multiple languages through the medium of English. Some of these languages were science language, specific to history, and nobody was making sure that they understood how these languages and how language changes as they're going into these different disciplines. So for example, in the science discipline, they draw on grammatical metaphor. So in science, the verbs and the adjectives becomes nouns. And so all of a sudden, the science discipline, it's known for abstract scientific knowledge production. So for example, water may evaporate, but scientists study and write about processes of evaporation, processes of condensation. So in second language users, these nouns, they don't understand that that is the process and that that word is heavily laden with processes built into it. It's now a noun. So the result in science is that there's this lexical density. It's not easy to read this text. It's not easy to understand how the information is packaged because it's really abstract entities. And so we've realized for our science students, there's particular kinds of discourses that needs to be unpacked. I've been speaking with colleagues. They were so enculturated into producing science knowledge, and they produce it through literacies and literacy practices. So for them, grammatical metaphor is abstract, it's common sense. So they're not realizing that these are the kinds of things that students need to be explicitly inducted into if they are to understand how their disciplines operate. So failing to make explicit the norms and practices of their tribe can result in conversations about the language problem, conversations about grammar and flow and style. So in South Africa, we started to try and move from the language problem to epistemic access. And epistemic access is a term that was coined in 2002 by one of our education philosophers, Wally Morrow. And for Morrow, he was saying that if students enter academia and academic practices developed around the search for knowledge, then students need to learn how to become a participant in this academic practice. So they need to understand, what does the discipline value? How is knowledge constructed? Does it value precise measurement, accurate observations and beliefs? Or does it value a knowledge system based on multiple truths and that objectivity is almost impossible? And so they need to understand how these disciplinary discourses are expressed through language. So if you, for example, take quantitative research and qualitative research, knowledge is constructed in a particular way, but we teach them the concept and we say what quantitative and qualitative research is, but what does it mean in terms of how they construct knowledge? And what are the values in terms of these two disciplines? And how's the discourses expressed through language? What language is used? Those are the kinds of things that we try to make explicit to our students. How do you know, just by looking at the discourses, that this is qualitative without seeing the word qualitative? How's the knowledge constructed? How does it show you what it's fundamentally about? What is the beliefs and the value systems of this particular construct? And what is your beliefs and your value system? So where do you see yourself? So for example, we would have students saying, oh, I'm going to do qualitative. Okay, why? I don't know. I think it's what I like. Others would say, but what do you like about it? Why? Others would say, no, I want to focus on facts. I want to just do precise measurement. So they had a clearer idea of why they were more into a particular domain than in another one. So what we're trying to say is that our focus should not just be on the language problem, but also on how to make explicit the discipline's epistemological core, the kind of knowledge that is valued. And how can students, for example, see kinds of knowledge that are excluded? So by giving them this kind of core, they get an understanding of the discourse, and maybe, just maybe, they become more critical of the discourse itself. So whose knowledge, and knowledge for what purpose, and whose knowledge is excluded? And hang on, how does this knowledge relate to the Kazakhstani context? Is it really relevant? And so they can start interrogating the discourses because they kind of understand how the languages function to create these discourses. So epistemological access kind of goes beyond the language problem because it kind of focuses on making explicit how language is used in the knowledge production system. Now, how this language is, this discourse is essentially part of this disciplinary course or disciplinary discourses that they're entering. And it's critical that they understand how language affirms it, but also more critical is that they see how it operates and then perhaps start having questions about how it affirms and whether it is really relevant in the context that they're working within. So she speaks of speaks of discourses, and he refers to primary and secondary discourse. And so I think students have to really make sense of the discourse. And I think once they make bit better sense of the discourse, it allows them to see perhaps why they're struggling. It also allows professors to understand where the issue is. So if we draw on G's notion of a discourse, which is ways of speaking, ways of reading and writing, ways of valuing and believing. So if you enter a particular disciplinary context, you want to become a member of a, you want to really be a meaningful member within this group. So you need to start looking at how are they speaking? How are my professors speaking? And what are they saying? So what does it mean about my professors' discourses? About my professors, what does she or he value? And do I think the same, or maybe I might be thinking something different? Because I'm entering this as a member and not just as a student that has to learn and regurgitate certain knowledges. So what was really useful was this distinction between primary and secondary discourses. And I think this, in a way, can kind of shed light for students on the challenges, the moments of complication when they enter university, be it as a postgraduate or undergraduate student, because primary discourses is the familiar discourses, it's the home discourses, according to G, and it's context embedded. It's who they are when they enter our institutions. It is who they are it's what they carry in their suitcases when they enter our courses. So it's a marker of their identity. In that context, they use their home language, and this is the language they use to make sense of the world. And in the South African context, the primary discourse is often influenced by socioeconomic circumstances. So our students, through tremendous odds, eventually gain access to universities. But because that primary discourse is so far removed from the secondary discourses, because of the socioeconomic circumstances, the odds are almost insurmountable. And I think that's part of the reason why we moved from academic socialization to an approach of academic literacies, to understand students' primary discourses and the literacies that they have, and how we can basically bring in those literacies once they enter university, which is the secondary discourses, the formal discourses, which is often context reduced because they have to write literature reviews, they have to write assignments and draw on other people. So in the secondary domain, discourses domain, they are taught through explicit instruction, but also they could enter from a primary discourse perspective where the schools that they come from might have taught behaviorists using behaviorist discourses where they need to regurgitate knowledge, just give back the facts. So by the time they get to a institution, say for example like NU, that has a different institutional discourse where we value student voice, we want students to interact with the content, we want to hear what they think and how they feel about their causes. So even that in itself for some students can be a moment of complication because their habitus, their body is so strongly used to just regurgitating facts. And so all of a sudden regurgitation of facts in the new context just doesn't buy it anymore. You don't get as high marks because regurgitation might not be what is needed in the secondary discourse at the university. And what makes it a secondary discourse is that it's a domain where it can lead to some kind of reward. So you can get a degree, you can get a certificate, and it leads to some kind of power. There could be money attached or prestige. And in the secondary discourse, we also have the gatekeepers. And these are the tests to measure performance. So those that measure up, they do it, they move ahead, and these gatekeepers can then also keep the unsuccessful ones out. And I think to a large extent in South Africa, that has been the case where the unsuccessful ones were kept out, and it was really then related to the language problem. And then a big question that Maro asked was, hang on, when are you going to ask, what is the institution doing? What are the institutional discourses, and how is it different? And how is it actually making sure that certain people are kept out? And that's how we needed to start to think differently about our students entering university. So when it comes to ways of being and our students entering our lecture halls and our seminar rooms, these are the sense-making spaces, right? And so we have all of these conversations, and like I said, if the secondary discourse in an institution is group work and collaboration, and students are just not used to that kind of discourse, that in itself becomes a stumbling block because they're not comfortable sharing, they're not comfortable chatting, and they're more individualistic, and they want to do things on their own. And then sometimes professors can think this is just a very difficult student. Why doesn't he want to participate? When actually it's part of the primary discourses to do things on its own. So then in these sense-making spaces can also be a space that can result in moments of complication. The assignment writing or assignments is most probably the vehicles where they have to use language to convey the disciplinary knowledge and understanding. And even there, so they have the secondary discourse that doesn't match the primary one, the school one, where they were used to rote learning. And then there's this assignment writing where they need to now show their understanding rather than regurgitation of facts, which requires more writing and more thinking through your writing. So the issue here is then how do we think about the potential discourse gaps between the primary discourse and the secondary discourses? What are the kinds of things that could potentially go wrong for our students, which is other than the language thing? So what, for example, are the kinds of things that we need to do to potentially highlight the gaps, but also find ways of working within those gaps so that our students become more comfortable. And within that gap, you would find that most probably some of your students all of a sudden confront these multiple selves. They have to take on a disciplinary self. So if I'm in the multilingual education course, I need to sound like, I need to use the concepts of multilingual education. I need to sound like it. I need to make sure that this is my language, this is my discourse. So within that disciplinary self, making explicit the different discourses within multilingual education, and how did it get to where we are currently, and where's it heading towards, and where are you within all of this, could help towards some kind of sense making of how to find a way within the discipline. Then there's the discoursal self. So how do I marry the discoursal self and the disciplinary self with the self as the persona, the person that entered with this primary discourse? And all of a sudden, my primary discourse was fine. My secondary discourse in my previous institution was also okay. I did pretty well. And all of a sudden now, there's this expectation that I need to marry these different selves, and students themselves might not even be aware of the fact that it's these multiple selves that has to be navigated within their academic writing. Professors themselves might also not know that there's this contention between these different and various selves. And so we end up saying it has to be English, it has to be the language. And I think once we can start thinking of all these multiple selves and get our students to basically make sense of where they fit into this discourse, where are they challenged, and what are these discourses, and what are the knowledge underpinnings, things that for us it's common sense. For them, it needs to be unpacked in a different way. So for example, if I think of students and they're doing assignments, I'm not sure if anyone wants to answer, but what is the first thing you do when you start with assignments? Anyone? Okay.
Searching the
Try
sources.
to, yes, search the sources.
The sources, good.
We try to find information about the discourse, or maybe about the topic first of all,
Okay.
and then move on.
Good. Thanks, Mina. So it's finding information about the topic. So basically you start at the bottom, on top, which is the assignment itself. And when you search for information, you're trying to get some knowledge going there. And then you use the academic conventions to write your assignment. Now, what Marta was saying, why not get our students to understand the circle, the inner circle right there? So if they understand the discourse and they understand what's happening within this discipline, what are the discourses associated with this discipline, they can start making sense of the discourse first, and then basically start asking particular questions about this discourse in relation to the assignment, and then go find the information and go like, oh, I see this happening in the articles that I'm reading. And then maybe, just maybe, there'll be some more critical questions coming because they're starting to use the discourses and not so much relying on just English grammar. So if they understand how the discourse community negotiates meaning, how they use language to negotiate such meaning, it might give them some access so that in the end, what we found in South Africa was even though the assignment, the English grammar was still not that perfect, which was the last thing we focused on, the knowledge, the kind of interrogation in terms of the assignment was much deeper. And then towards the end, we could actually show students, well, actually, you're beginning to make sense. But now after this, so once they go through these processes, the final thing we do is now let's look at grammar. Let's look at the surface things. But the first thing we try and instill is think of the discourse. Think of the language used in this particular discipline to create this discourse. So, there's nothing not going. Sorry. I don't know why my screen. Okay, there's it. So, in terms of getting them to understand the discourses, Wenger speaks about situated learning, right? So there's particular practices that will take us to the discourse. So how can we get students to get to the discourse? And if you look at Wenger's understanding of situated learning, you can see the full participants, those that knows everything. They fit within the discourse circle, right? They know how the discourses operate. So our students now enter and they've been accepted at university, and now you've acquired legitimate peripheral participation. So it means you have participation, you have access. You can do within the space now, and you start interacting with new entrants. You start wanting to know how things work, try and make sense of that. So the first thing you try and do in legitimate peripheral participation is trying to understand the institutional discourses and practices, right? So course syllabi, for example, assessment, thesis, when are all of these things due? How does it all happen? So now you've got a legitimate peripheral participation, and now you're going to understand that. And then you start seeking out conversations that are taking place. So professors ask you to do particular assignments. So you start understanding the content. You start understanding where to find information. And to do this, before you enter institutions, make sure that you have some English capabilities. For some institutions, you need to have an IELTS. For others, it's some other English basic test. So you can only acquire legitimate peripheral participation through having those operational literacy skills. So if you have it and you've entered, why are we still saying there's a language problem? Because you have shown that you actually can write sentences, you can spell, you can do punctuation. So what is needed other than that operational literacy skills? So then you start being exposed to, maybe in previous context as undergrad, the cultural literacy. So what does the culture do? What are the kinds of literacy practices that they kind of draw on, which in academia would be referencing, citations, paraphrasing, searching for information, and so forth. But now you want to kind of move closer to the circle. You want to get closer to the full participants. So in all of this, you are actually busy with communities of practice. You're practicing particular things. And as you go further into the circle, closer to the center, your progress is based on riskier tasks. So at undergrad, you might have been doing some assignments and some tests. At postgrad, now you need to do a master's thesis, right? So it's a bit riskier. You kind of recognizing that this perspective that I have is just one perspective of many perspectives. Now, what is the communities of practices to negotiate my perspective on the issue? And how do I acknowledge other perspectives, and how do I bring other perspectives on the issue? That is more complex than just the cultural literacies on the other side. And as I move closer, I need to start understanding the disciplinary epistemologies and how knowledge is produced. So you will again see that in coming closer to the circle and the discourses and the gatekeepers, it's more about how knowledge is produced. It's more about understanding the epistemologies, and then perhaps getting to a point where I start understanding that my research is just a perspective within a particular context, with particular data, for example. So if I think of in our context, for example, students took them long to get to critical literacies because they would, for example, still see their work as, for example, Professor, I want to research this. So I need to find data to show this, right? So the question is, why are you trying to find data to show something? Shouldn't you get your data and see what the data tells you within this disciplinary context that you find yourself in? So what if the data says something different? What if your data shows something unique from what you're finding in the literature? Isn't that something different? Isn't that a major contribution than fitting the data, for example, to suit your theory? So you're doing research for the sake of reproducing, or are you doing research of becoming critical and showing how knowledge is produced in particular contexts? So as you move towards full participant, especially master's, PhD, going into publications, you start seeing yourself as contributors to scholarship. So you're not only a consumer, you're not taking in, but you're contributing to this amazing conversation that's going on around you. And so you also realize that there's an ongoing conversation. It's not a finished conversation. So as you've been reading and you've been doing your research, you're contributing to a conversation that happened, and you might be extending the conversation, or you might be producing a completely novel idea about the conversation. And so communities of practices, again, it's about moving to full participant. And what we are arguing is, let's look at what full participants are doing right from the start and teach them those kinds of epistemologies, the stuff that's happening in the center that nobody makes explicit, that nobody makes clear right from the start. And maybe then we might create a cohort of really critical thinkers. And that was the situation for us in South Africa at the time. So if you think of the practices and you kind of interact with your professors, you can see the practices, you can emulate them, you can want to be like them, but where else as a student can you find the discourses of your discipline? Where else can you find how to do it better and how to understand what needs to happen? Because academic socialization it's a dynamic process and it's socially situated. And it's now often, it has multimodality included, it's multilingual, and it's highly intertextual. So as a student, you need to find your way in this and ask yourself, so, okay, if it's socially situated and it's multimodal, how is this happening currently in the area that I'm working in? For professors, the process should include modeling, that should include explicit feedback, not just about the language, but also about the discourses, about the critical literacies that are so important to get our students into the center. And then obviously for students, it means it's an uptake. You need to do something. There needs to be some kind of investment and some kind of agency that if you want to get to the center, what can I do? How can I do things differently, for example? How can I find out what the epistemological knowledge is of the area that I'm working within? So, for example, if we think of students having to read journal articles, how explicit did we make this journal article? Do they know that they know there's an article title, there's a journal title, but now why is the journal title in italics? This is a source within a source. So why are we doing it like this in this particular way? What is the reason? Why do we have the DOI? And the authors, there's a first author and a second author. What does it mean? It's part of how we produce knowledge. So students should know this explicitly. What does this mean? Why is the article not in italics? Why is there a date? The currency of knowledge, the contribution of particular authors in this particular context. So how can you as a student then use a journal article to socialize you into academic literacies and disciplinary discourses? And what are the kinds of things that you can note to make sure that you kind of get closer to the center and understand the discourses associated with your discipline, rather than just the language and rather than just mimicking and emulating he said, she said? How can you make sense of what's happening? So when you read academic text, you read a journal article, I think for students, the tendency is to read for knowledge, but to understand the discourses and the practices of your area, you should actually be looking for language use and the discourses associated with this language use. So for example, the use of citations. It would be useful to locate it in the sentence. So if it's at the beginning of the sentence, it always starts with according to, or it starts with the author itself. And if it starts with the author itself, there would be reporting verbs, for example. So how's language used when it starts with according to, or it starts with Bedeker 2020? What is used there? So even though my English grammar might not be that great, but at least I know how to start a sentence with the citation, which we normally call the author-led citations. So what happens when the author is at the back? How does that change? So they have access, students have access, and you have access to understanding the referencing conventions or the citation conventions within sentences, right? So you start emulating that. That's a community of practice. It's just something you can do to fit into the community, something you can do when you start with your writing. Then when you do look at your articles, look at the disciplinary concepts. Look at the theories and how language is used to define it. So in your discipline, for example, in mine, we have language is a semiotic resource. I can use that. I'm allowed to use that in my discipline. I will cite it, but it's not my own words, it's not my own language. But I've started to note what are the discursive languages and phrases that I can use within my discipline. So if you start annotating the concepts, you start looking at how language is used to explain these contexts, or to define these contexts, it becomes part of your academic discourse. It becomes part of your understanding the disciplinary discourse and concepts of your area, because they cannot be changed. Semiotic resource is a semiotic resource. I cannot change it into something else, but I can explain what it is. So you start having an arsenal of language and language discourses that makes you fairly part of the discourse community that you're having this conversation about. Then when you do read your articles, map the conversations. Who's speaking? And why are they speaking? Look at the old sources and the new sources. Why are the old sources there? Who are they? And what are they contributing to this conversation? And where do you see the writer entering the conversation? And so what language phrases does the writer use to signal this, right? So you start thinking of how you can indicate your entry point into a scholarly conversation. Then if you look at your citations and your references, and you start seeing them as different voices, right? If you look at other text, there's a lot of, for example, narrative, you'll have he said, she said. You might have the boy told the girl. So there's all these voices, alternative voices entering the text. So citations it's a voice, it's somebody else's voice that's entering your text. And why is this voice then important? So when you look at voices and citations, who's been invited into this conversation in the article and who's been left out? And if these are the only people invited in, what does it mean? And so what's the discourse that they are kind of wanting to create within this journal article? And how does it fit in with the kinds of discourses that you've been thinking about, the kinds of discourses that you've been learning about within your discipline? So as you start looking at journal articles in this particular way, you kind of look at the literacy practices within this particular article. You're kind of finding ways of kind of situating your own writing. Remember, I spoke about the disciplinary self and the discoursal self, where you need to take on the discourses of the community, where you need to take on the disciplinary concepts of the community. And so by looking at your journal articles in this particular way, you start finding ways of indicating and ways of doing in your own writing. Issues like the use of acronyms, right? How does it happen in the article and why? I remember students in the UAE saying, oh, but ma'am, why must I first write it in full? Everyone knows it's the UAE, right? So I want to use the UAE. And so it's this kind of thing. Do people know your concepts? And so why are you using acronyms, and what's the use of acronyms, and how's it being used within the articles that you reading? And then look at the discourses in methods and the findings sections. How can this help you when you do your own thesis? And how can this help you to situate your own writing? So finally, some concluding thoughts. So if we draw on Mara, to get back to what he said, it's like to provide epistemic access is to really make explicit that being a participant in an academic practice is to learn the intrinsic disciplines and the standards that makes that practice. So what is important in this particular practice? So we cannot talk about discipline without involving ourselves in discourse. So my course syllabus, my readings, my assignments are all indicative of the discourses that I draw on. And it kind of constitutes this discourse. So this is my discourse. Where's my students? Who are they? And how do I kind of enculturate them into my discourse? But how do I get them to critique my discourse? Because that's fundamentally what we want, for them to start interrogating discourses and start saying, oh, hang on, Professor, I'm not in full agreement because this kind of thinking gives us this, and I'm seeing that this one is not, there's no mention of this. And so it's just that thing where they start actually interrogating, they start actually, where we say students have to be critical, we're actually giving them access to start to think about being critical without saying you must be critical thinkers. And then when we start kind of interrogating our constructs, our discourses, we can also maybe start to see how other structural factors might be involved in denying success to some groups of students. We can also start to ask, so how does the way we teach and assess privilege some and disadvantage, for example, others? And so as a final thought, I think we need to make sure that we our students, and as academics, we become explicitly aware of our epistemological core, the kind of knowledge valued by the discipline, and the kinds of knowledge that are excluded, and which linguistic constructions are best used to kind of represent the tribe disciplinary knowledge. And I know in the South African context where we have academic development programs where the academic instructor works within the English frame, but they have to teach science students. And then so their understanding of the science discourse is not getting explicitly to the epistemological core. And that is where the academic instructor and the science professors actually started to work together. It was quite interesting to see how professors had to start to think about what is this? And the things that they saw as common sense, they started to realize, oh, actually, I've been putting my students in boxes where I thought they were lazy and I just thought that they couldn't do this and it's beyond them and that they are underprepared. But I've been using these discourses without realizing they need some kind of access, meaningful access to how knowledge is produced in my discipline. So I thank you. I hope this was useful. And I'm not sure if I have any questions. I see there's some questions in the chat room. No. Okay. So thank you, guys. Bridget. Good. Okay. Bridget, I've got your one, a small but key point in values. I found higher education colleagues prefer the citation at the end of the sentence, while multilingual scholars tend to be author forward, even called on, and I didn't even have the language to explain the difference. Well, thanks, Liz. Bridget, what we, in academic literacy, we kind of found that the people starting with what we call author-led is that the students were not comfortable yet with their own paraphrase. So it just became easier to say, according to Goodman 2020 explains. And then as you get like really deeper into academic conventions, it is actually much stronger to not rely on the author that much. So we try to tell them to alternate between the two, because they found the second one, the information-led one, really difficult because they had to paraphrase and then obviously put the author at the end. So so I think in terms of the two, in terms of academic writing, we would encourage both and basically get our students to see how the paragraphs flow much better with a citation at the end or an information-led citation. Okay. Questions? Gabby. Thanks, Liz. Any more questions? Wait, I'm going up, sorry. Thanks, Bridget. Hello. Problem with sound, I'm so sorry. Okay, Bridget, are you saying discourse and discourses are the same thing? Or do you mean discourses equals various discursive practices rather than, yes. Discourses for me, Bridget, would be the various discursive practices rather than how people just talk about the concept in the field. So it's a range of, it's not just a discourse. So I'm kind of always hesitant to just use the word discourse and try and rather be as flexible by seeing it as discourses rather than just one thing. Okay. Okay, which approach do you use in your research? I'm not sure whether you're speaking about my method, whether you're speaking about, who asked that question? Maybe you can just elaborate for me which approach?
Dia, Oscar, can you speak up and ask your question in person?
Sorry, my English is not so good as your English, but my question is because I studied research design, and my question is about the way which you use, because I can say that discourse analysis is a different way of study society,
Okay.
maybe. And as I understood, you told not about this discourse analysis. I just cannot understand. Do you talk about a way of understanding reality, or do you talk about this approach? It's about discourse analysis approach.
Okay, I think I understand you now. I think when I speak about this, when we refer to discourses, we basically were trying to say, understand, professors need to make sure that they understand the discoursal knowledge of the disciplines. So it's not really doing discourse analysis, but highlighting those discourses from the professor's perspective. I draw on discourses, but I use a linguistic framework because the world is how we negotiate meaning is through language. So I kind of try and do discourse analysis, drawing on linguistic frameworks and theories that situates how language is making meaning in particular contexts.
Thank you.
Anas, thank you. Kumba, thank you. No more questions? Thank you, Joseph.
Yeah, we can take one more question from the audience and then we will finalize our webinar as it's like closer to 5 p.m. So thank you, Michelle, very much. I was like, curious myself to get to know more about discourses and different perspectives. You like touched up on like, how the way students think about their professors and the discourse the professors are using in their teaching and overall speaking. Very insightful. I join Manas in his comments.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone, for listening. I'm not sure whether I negotiated meaning in the appropriate way, but it was definitely a means for me to kind of think about the Kazakhstani context in relation to what we did in South Africa. So I'm more aware now, understanding the context after a year, thinking of my students' primary discourses and the secondary discourses expected at university. But I think I'm more aware of my own discourses and trying to find ways for my students to see my discourses, but also to disagree with my way of looking at the world. And so I I'm hoping to try and give them different perspectives on particular issues so that they can find the one that they think is applicable for them. And I think it kind of brings robust discussions in classes when students start saying, well, I prefer this perspective because of the following kinds of things. So thank you so much for joining. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Then we'll close our webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Later in the evening, we'll post the recording to the NUGSE YouTube channel. You can just search it by the name of Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Education. Thank you, Michelle. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thanks, B. Thanks, Michelle, for coming and all the students.